No resolution. Episode 2. Art Institutions.
Hello everybody! Welcome to the second episode of No Resolution, a platform organized by CREA where matters pertinent to the art world and society at large are discussed by renowned speakers in an informal debate setup. Today we are talking about art institutions, their colonial past, the establishment of a museum format, and the power structures resulting from it. How are the institutions dealing with the growing expectations of diversity and inclusivity within them? And are the new inclusionist programs and exhibitions a shiny beacon of hope, or merely a neocolonial agenda in disguise? To discuss this and many other statements, we have the pleasure of welcoming three fantastic speakers. Mariana, Rebola, a Portuguese visual artist and editor, Jeroen Laven, PR and communication manager at Rotterdam's Kunstinstituut Melli, and Amanda Fayant, an indigenous artist and researcher. Could you all perhaps tell us a little bit more about yourselves?
I'm Mariana. I'm an artist and magazine editor in Portugal. I'm also studying arts, culture and society at Erasmus University to try to complement my artistic practice with a more sociological view of society. In terms of personal practice, I relate more to womanhood and growth subjects in a very intimate perspective through different visual media.
My name is Jeroen Laven. I studied art history at the University of Utrecht. And in 2016, I started at Witte de Wit Center for Contemporary Art, which is now known as Kunstinstituut Melli. We changed our name in January of this year. And I work as the PR and communication manager for the institute.
Tanishi, my name is Amanda Nicole Fayant. I have a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Film Production and a Master of Philosophy in Indigenous Studies. I'm an artist and a researcher. I'm Cree Métis Soto. I am originally from land called Treaty 4. I'm a descendant of original Métis families which settled in the area. I'm currently working on many different art projects. I work with installations, new media, especially sound, and I am also a guest lecturer and a researcher at University of Alberta in Canada. Miigwech.
Thank you all for your introductions. Before we get started, I would like to just give a little explanation of the format this discussion will take. What CREA and No Resolution has prepared for you are 5 statements, which we are not really affiliated with. They are sometimes a little controversial, and they are supposed to just stir a little discussion, start a conversation. So I will start reading those statements one by one, and the discussion, hopefully quite naturally, will emerge. So if the format is clear, I think we can start with the first statement, which is: the recent social media posts and online statements by art institutions criticizing discrimination and pledging for inclusiveness and diversity are merely fraudulent moves in a marketing game to prevent losing face. And with this one, I am really curious to hear Jeroen's thoughts on the matter. So perhaps Jeroen, you could start.
Yeah, of course. Fraudulent is maybe a bit of a harsh word, but it's very difficult, I feel, for an art institute, especially, to send out something on a platform that is envisioned or even made for personal use. For example, if I post something for Kunstinstituut Melli, the persons that are viewing the post are seeing it as another person speaking, which makes it sometimes very hard to speak for the whole institution. For example, during the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of people posted the black square, and also a lot of institutes posted the black square. It was seen as merely a statement and nothing else. So it's also has to do, I think, with how an institute, after placing it, or even before publishing something like that, already send out a press release or is working inside with exhibitions, artists from people of color. If those things are already in place, then it's quite a different story. But if it's an institute just posting a black square and then doing nothing, or not even posting afterwards about the same subject, then yeah, I can see, or I can feel that people see it as a fraudulent move.
My notes on this were also that, is it like just performative, just to like go as if it's a trend and it's taken as a hot topic, which is very disrespectful towards the important matters? Or is it actually leading to like internal work in institutions and deconstructing certain paradigms that are in place that have a lot of bias sometimes, and racism, or just some sort of stereotypes regarding certain marginalized groups?
Yeah, and I think those shows of support are still important. But the difficult thing with social media also, I feel, is that we can post that black square and we can do all the other things behind the scenes, but how do you show all the people that are only seeing that black square that you're also doing all those things? And that's quite a difficult thing to do. It's also a balance in, especially for my job, how to balance that communication, that outwards to everybody, showing, yes, we're showing support by posting this because we think it's important to show that support, but also look at all these things, the exhibitions that we did 3 years ago that aren't on Instagram anymore because you have to swipe like several months. That's quite hard. How do you, yeah, it's hard to find that balance sometimes.
If I can just pop in here. Yeah, there was so much that was said. I totally agree with a lot of it. And when I hear things like inclusiveness and diversity, I get big question marks in my head, because I'm like, inclusiveness in what way? How? Where? When? Is it at the institutional level? Is it at some other level, the board, for instance, or things like that? And then for me, it's always, what is the institution and how much is that idea innately colonial and imperial in terms of perception and what it is we are doing in terms of showing or making? How do we go further than just having the square or the orange t-shirt that shows every child matters? And for me, I think a big thing is changing the archive in a sense of, what do you share? How can it be a learning moment? And also, as a researcher, how can I change who I cite and whose knowledges I share to sort of make the conversation go a bit further than just the square? So yeah, you want these institutions that have so much more power to not be able to take advantage of things that are happening in our communities.
Jeroen, Mariana, do you maybe have something to add?
I would completely agree. Yeah, the people that you quote or the people that you use as foundational for what is the knowledge that we have, sometimes already that base is not even or not fair. So and it's hard to deconstruct things so much that you have to access these previous ideas. Yeah.
No, I agree. And again, I think really speaking from what I have experienced working at an institution that changed its name because we had a name that had a colonial past. It is very important to invite different voices that weren't mentioned before or we didn't listen to before. It was very important to us to give them space first to speak about the problems and everything that needed to change before we could even send something out ourselves. So I totally agree. Yeah.
Jeroen, since you touched upon the colonial past of the art institutions, perhaps that is a good transition towards this next statement, which is, the implications of colonialism are still evident in how we perceive art in the Western world, as museums continue to impose the authority of European aesthetic values and strategies of exhibition. And here I am excited to hear what Amanda has to say.
Yeah, that's a really big thing. And a lot of the things I've written and studied or researched have to do with this idea of the institution and essentially how it goes back to this idea of hierarchy. As a student, as a younger student, I would constantly be crashing into these ideas of hierarchies because in my community, we very much raised with the philosophy of the four directions, the medicine wheel, which is a circle. And everything, every part of life is interconnected. And so this idea of institutions separating, I've often struggled with, and I feel like it's a way sometimes to allow art and art practice to become very sensitive in a sense to what people think is valuable. So because it's only art, in a sense, they're like, how is it valuable to science, or how is it valuable to math, and these sorts of things. Whereas my home education, in a sense, was more about how everything is connected. So art is an integral part, art practice of everyday life, and all of the things that we do. And so I really am questioning many things about the institution, including from an Indigenous feminist point of view of whose voices, why, and we still come to this problem of where is the value when it's part of this sort of institutional thing. And I feel like that's like an oxymoron when it comes to art practice, when you want to have the product over the practice. In a sense, the institution seems to be giving more space to this idea of value instead of sharing knowledge and sharing practices as well.
I agree with Amanda with the sense of hierarchies in the way that they are constructed in Europe, that it is very prevalent in the art world, and especially within the art market. For example, with this idea of like certain artists having a bigger name and being automatically more respected. And yeah, the price and the financial success of artists being very much a measure of how they might be important for contemporary actions and culture. It's very tricky, and it's very much a Western construction or a Western view of things. I've heard this from people working or selling at art fairs, that the normal people don't buy art or are not interested in art, which is such a misconception. Sometimes it's just the access that is done to like a privileged elite, and showcase sort of work that is sellable for only people who have money. And there is no real connection to people's like mundane or just, yeah, to just people's reality, most people's reality. And that's something that is decided. It's not just a natural way of things being, and it's something that can be worked on.
I agree. And also looking at contemporary art itself, what I feel is that we are trying to get more people to experience contemporary art. If you're not even interested in culture, we think it's very important that you at least experience one time. And then if you don't like it, fine as well. But there is a big threshold, even talking about contemporary art, that it's for the elite. You need to study it. You had to have a university degree, or you need to read very, very difficult texts that are on the wall. So there's already that threshold. And then on top of that, you have the market that it's so closed off. You have to be rich to even buy something, which is also weird. But I think the most difficult thing is to change the whole perception of how to experience contemporary art. Also looking at public programs that are always paid for, you always need to buy a ticket. Why is it not free for everybody? Museums in London are free for everybody. Why aren't they free in Amsterdam and Rotterdam? So also all those things add up to everything that you just said, and makes it very difficult, I think, to change that whole perception.
I totally agree. And I try to think that there is a story when you're an artist. There's a story behind what you're doing, a story is what. And I think maybe that is a way to like connect people, because maybe you might not express it, the story, in the same way, but you can definitely connect to someone else's experience of living or being, or even wanting to express. And so I think that is so much more valuable than all these talks about, the names and the numbers and And I think that's super scary to people who aren't in the institution or in the art academies and things. So I think we really are missing out on an opportunity to share ways that people can connect to these things, where it's like, oh, I get why this could be something for me. So I think that's also kind of key.
Yeah, on that line, like also sometimes this idea of, for example, institutions making it more relatable to people in terms of text and making it understandable, and forcing, in a sense, people to go to these museums or these exhibitions, instead of it coming from the point where, for example, artists work from a humane level. Like there is a connection from the beginning where most people derive from their existence, like in society in general, and from that get inspiration to do whatever sort of work. And from that level in the beginning, it is connected to everyone's experience, even if they are not creatives, even if they see it a little bit different in their communities. And I think sometimes it should connect more on that like grounded level from the creation directly to the public experience, more than trying to explain theories in a simple ways or trying to make certain constructs, theorized constructs, seem very important for some people. I really appreciate, for example, art critique and sometimes complex ways of thinking about art. But I can understand that sometimes for quite a large piece of an audience, also for my magazine, it's more about like, how is this in any way connected to my living as well? And that can come a lot from the artist's individual testimony.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree that, for example, speaking about the exhibitions that are right now on view, the wall texts are maybe not accessible for everybody, but next to the wall text, we offer tours, and next to the tours, we offer a public program, and next to the public program, we offer tours for students. We offer online activities for people that can't come to the museum and want to experience the exhibition with a video and a printout. There are so many different ways in presenting the exhibition or the art or the artist or the artwork. There's no just one right way, and I think it also has to do with trying to ask different people to give their explanation and trying to ask different curators to criticize the same exhibition or ask different journalists to write about the exhibition. I mean, it's about multiple voices instead of just one. And again, coming back to the first question, that is sometimes really hard for an institution to be viewed as multiple voices. We're not one person running the whole thing. We're many different voices, many different artists. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to the language. I think the problem still sometimes exists in this idea that we probably get from the educational system, which is, why is this important to me? For instance, a really cheesy or stupid example, like I don't know a whole lot about chemistry, but I do understand its value to life and the world and things like that. And so I think that our educational system really does not do many favors for that connection being able to happen, where people are like, oh yeah, I should have access to that, and oh yeah, this is important to not just creating things, but it's important to math and science. And
Jeroen and Mariana spoke about the problem of access and different thresholds one faces when visiting a museum, and now talking about the multiple voices and lack of diversity, perhaps it would be good to move to the next statement, which is art institutions are some of the few spaces in which different perspectives are acknowledged and can coexist, thereby accommodating different imaginations of a more strong and egalitarian society. Mariana, what would you say to that?
I would say that art institutions are doing an active effort to be that sort of accommodating space. But especially here in the Netherlands, for example, I notice there is a real effort to try to open up and think about things differently and more critically. For example, in Portugal, where I'm from, it's very problematic because even colonial issues are not openly admitted. It's as if it hasn't even reached it. And yeah, I would also say that sometimes artists are more connected to humanitarian, sometimes leftist principles, which could be more open to all sorts of people and all sorts of experiences. But then within the system of the art world and art market and everything, it starts being a little bit stiffer than that. And this dreamy sense of everyone having a chance in practice, unfortunately, doesn't come through.
I agree with Mariana that in the Netherlands, a lot of institutions are trying very hard to open up their space to as many voices as possible. But at the same time, you're still missing out a big group. If you're inviting a certain voice, then you have to make sure that the next time you invite a different voice, but still you're not inviting everybody. So I feel it's a very difficult task to be perceived as open as possible for everybody. And I think that's what Amanda meant with diversity at the beginning. what does that mean that you're diverse? What does it mean that you're open to everybody? If you're saying you're diverse or you're open to a certain group of people, who are you then leaving out? And I also feel that we still don't have the right vocabulary to even talk about this without leaving people out. So it's a difficult one.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, they are often spaces. And I have to say that in terms of my experience as an art institution, as an art academy for a learning space, is very different from what my Bachelor of Fine Arts was like. But I also wonder, art institutions are often so on their own in a sense. And this is also what I've noticed with the art academies. They're just sort of on their own, this own space, that should they be the only space where we can have these sorts of open and important discussions. And one of the things I appreciate about the Bachelor in Canada is that the fine arts was a part of the entire university, and the student gallery was a part of the entire university. So every student had to walk by it, whether you took engineering or medicine or theater. And then also, because fine arts was located within the university, we often worked very much with all of the other departments. Like if we needed actors, we worked with the theater department. If we needed backgrounds, it was artists, other artists we worked with. And then we could even pull in, sometimes engineering and other types of students. So yeah, I felt like that embedded fine arts department within the university was a really great way to sort of expose everybody to how it can be a space, because a lot of university students were like, poke their head in the gallery, like, oh, is this okay? And it's like, yeah, come in, have a look, and just, it's okay. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, because for Kunstinstituut Melly, we're located on the second and third floor of a pretty large building in the city of Rotterdam. And we've always been located on the second and third floor, because on the ground floor there was a school when we moved into the building in 1990. So you had to already go up 2 or 3 steps. You couldn't see it from the street, so it was already behind a curtain. But just 4 years ago, we moved back to the ground floor with a new space that we just called Melly, so without Kunstinstituut. And all the public program is happening there. And it has large windows that are viewable from the street. And certainly everybody felt welcome at the institution. There was no threshold anymore to move in, because it was there on view from the street already. So there was no barrier, no curtain. We weren't hidden. And that already helped so much in getting new voices in, and making people feel comfortable to also be vulnerable and speak out if they weren't agreeing with something, or they wanted to just say something that maybe they wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, but this really links up to education, as Amanda said before, because I remember when I did my high school in arts, the arts corridor was like the basement of the school. And it was reconstructed, and it was still in the basement in a corridor that no one from the other fields passed by. It's just like a hidden corner that barely had light. And it's so peculiar that I feel like all these stigmas are really evident in the way that space is also organized. Sometimes around cultural events or cultural sites where they're like little corners or sketchy areas, and it's just like taken out of other parts of society and cities. Yeah, and it's so important for accessibility indeed.
Well, if there's nothing to add from Jeroen and Mariana, then seeing that the topic of the museum format came up, maybe it's interesting to continue to the next statement. As a consequence of the neoliberal growth ideology, the expansion of the art museum format across the globe as a symbol of power and capital overshadows pressing cultural, social, and environmental issues. Amanda, maybe you could start with your reaction.
Yeah, that's a really big question. I have to say that I've noticed back home that, and in some places, that there is sort of a movement that's moving against this growth sort of ideology, and instead focusing on relationships within communities. So I can't say this is something that I would have the most experience with, because just basically from the outset, I find the whole symbols of power and the idea of capital and product sort of being an oxymoron when it comes to art and art production. So I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, this is a difficult one, and my first reaction is that I disagree because I think it still is very important that these museums are there, and of course they should talk about the cultural, social, and environmental issues. And I don't want to use the word power, but let's use it for now because certain art museums have certain power and have a certain network, address a certain public, um, have a certain amount of visitors, and then talk about these social, cultural, and environmental issues. They also address these issues to that public, that network, that amount of people that visit the museum each year.
But yeah, as Jeroen said, like there are some museums that are, for example, hallmarks whenever someone visits a city or a country. And in that sense, they have like a symbolic power and help shape people's perception of culture throughout ages. And we now know, if we think about it critically, that all the things that, for example, were preserved or that are shown are sometimes either sexist in the choice of authors, or they leave out a lot of people from different communities that may preserve their works differently, or have other sort of work that is more ephemeral and less within the paradigms of the, for example, the main art forms that are valued in the West. And then if this is what is presented in museums all the time, it's people's sense of art has to be according to that, to what they see in these spaces. But at the same time, though, I do feel like institutions are more and more trying to step up to the contemporary issues that worry everyone and try to have like sometimes temporary exhibitions interlinked with the museum's collection and so on that makes sense for what is happening in the world in recent years. They're not necessarily overshadowing what's happening. I think there is more and more a sense of it's important to be connected to what worries everyone. But it's a slow process, especially for big institutions. It takes a long time until sometimes they recognize that something is wrong in how they've been acting and what they can transform. It really takes a lot of time, and that is a little bit frustrating sometimes.
I can imagine that is frustrating, but it also has to do, I guess, with having a collection and only working with that collection. For an institute like Kunstinstituut Melli, we're inviting a new artist every 4 months and mostly inviting that artist to make new work. So for us, it's, I think, much easier to address certain contemporary issues on the spot with that artist, making new work about that issue instead of going into your collection that is centuries old and then changing the whole setup of your museum. I think that's a much, much slower process because you have to research everything that's in your collection. You have to ask new names to research all the things that are written also about it. So it is a very slow process. And I can imagine that some people think it's going too slow. But I agree with Mariana that it is happening. Right now, more and more institutions now coming up also in the Netherlands, specifically talking about, for example, environmental issues. So there is a change.
I guess for me, one of the biggest problems is this idea of power and why and to what end. And often I see it as like these art institutions are owning and giving value to themselves in order to have a certain status. So when you take away their own saying, I'm important, this is important, what value is it really having there? And that's again where we're like getting to this into this like disconnection sometimes. And then also this idea of collecting and commercializing is so directly connected to the whole imperialism and colonialism. It's if you're going to decolonize, what would a museum actually look like? And this is something I've been really working on and writing about in terms of feminism and women's voices in museums and in collections. So what do we collect and why and to what purpose sometimes? And I think if every institution was honest and said, you know, we give value because of this, this, and this, not because we know something you don't know, I might feel a little bit better about the whole process because at least it's honest then and saying, you know, we attribute power and value because we want to support the lifestyle that we live and have, which is a colonial way of of viewing life in a sense that, you know, power and status is what life is really all about. And so you need to collect these things. And that's essentially where I have the problems with it. But, and then also like who gets to collect and who has access to the collections. And so all these things, that's like what goes around my mind. So it's hard for me to have like a yes or a no, I guess. But those are just the things that like happen in my head when I think about power, status, why is this painting worth more than that painting and things like that. Like it really feels like now I'm talking about something that isn't directly related to art practice or even being an artist. Yeah, so I think if the institution is going to decolonize, even that word decolonize, what will that mean? And what is that perspective? And what benefit can it have for the art institution as it is now?
You are asking the right questions, but it's so hard to give an answer to those questions. I mean, speaking from the experience that I had in the past 3 years of changing our name, being asked by artists and participants and curators to change our name because of a colonial past, the main thing that I think a lot of my colleagues learned is that vulnerability is one of the biggest things that you need to accept. You need to accept to be vulnerable to new ideas, to new voices, to new meaning, to unlearn certain things and to relearn other things. And to do those things, you need to change, and you have to be vulnerable, and it's quite hard sometimes. And I think that also has to do with decolonizing an institution, the people working at the institution, the public going to that institution for 30 years. Suddenly the institution is presenting different names, for example, or changing its name. The public also needs to be vulnerable and be open also. But being in a process for the last 3 years, I think changing yourself, your perspective on certain things, and being vulnerable to new voices, that's a lot of work, hard work.
The one thing I always try to express is that as an Indigenous person, I grew up on the other side, you know, always not really cracking the code and not really understanding what this curriculum, what the perspective was. So I came from the side of like, I'm not this collective we, when it was like a we. I was never a part of that collective we because I didn't grow up this way, and everything I was meeting in the school system was so opposite. And so I think that's really key as well for people to be open and to be exposed to the idea that you can be uncomfortable and you may not have access to something, but that might be somebody's everyday life experience. And a gallery back home did a really great job of curating a show where all the signs outside were in Cree syllabics. And, you know, I'm sure there was a lot of people in town who are like, well, I can't read that. That's pretty dumb. Or, you know, but also that idea of it's okay to not be able to read it, because lots of people have those experiences in the colonial sort of homogenetic way we siphon people through systems in these days. So that's just like a random thought I guess I had about it.
I think Amanda touched upon something important here. This whole idea of not being part of a collective, we being uncomfortable or taking comfort for granted, creates a societal division and a specific power structure within the art world. And as Mariana and Jeroen were suggesting, who has that power, how that power is structured, who has the access to museum collections matters hugely. So perhaps in the light of those thoughts, it would be interesting to move on to the last statement on our list, which is mistrust and opportunism are now a structural component of our globalized society and have become necessary modes of operation within the contemporary art world and its labor markets. Without a doubt, this is a controversial statement, and I am really curious to hear what Amanda's thoughts on this one are.
Oof. Wow. I mean, I would feel really sad if that's like really true. My whole practice is based on these ideas of like responsibility, relationality, and relatability. Also, like relationships, connecting. So I just like.
But do you think it's true?
I mean, I do it is a reason why I've stepped away from, for a long time, and a big part of my career, I stepped away from the art world, and especially after, I don't know, I've just gotten so tired of like seeing almost like the same thing in galleries everywhere I go, where it's always the same kinds of things that people consider contemporary for a period, at least it's in how people were curating. So yeah, I have stepped back, but I think for me it's a different reason as well, in that I don't necessarily feel comfortable in the system, and I now have the opportunity to work within a system that feels better for me, and that's the medicine wheel. And I really link my work and thoughts into that, so I feel like that's my connection. And of course, if I was to go out into this dark corner of the art world, I don't know if I don't know.
If you, I mean, my job is like 20% on social media at the institution, and if I would believe everything I see on social media, and if I would believe everything on Facebook by Trump or Wilders in the Netherlands, or there are many other political parties, then yes, mistrust and opportunism are now a structural component. So I think that part of the statement is very true, but I think especially the art world that I'm part of right now, the contemporary art world in Rotterdam and in the Netherlands, we're trying very hard to do something that is next to that, so people can also have something that isn't mistrust and opportunism, that's real and factual and open to different voices and yeah, so I think part of this statement is true, but the other part of the statement should be that the art world is also trying very hard to go against this mistrust and opportunism.
Yeah. And I guess I would think it has always been a part of that system. It's just not just now. It always has been that way. It's just that we look back on things that are like, oh, it developed in like a rosy, wonderful way, but actually it was always dark corners and things like that. So yeah,
we just know everything right now. I mean, you have to open up your phone and you know what's happening in America. I mean, my grandfather didn't know what happened in America, only that the new president was chosen. But again, the globalization can be used by the contemporary art world by posting exhibitions on the internet, by doing live streams, by doing panels like this, talking about these statements and trying to give a different voice that is the opposite of mistrust and opportunism. That's real and personal.
Yeah. I guess like as an artist, I would more likely want to show at like a gallery that's more works in the way that I work. So those are the kinds of places I would seek out as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that it's kind of weird, because in the film industry, when I was working in film, mainly film and in documentary and especially experimental films as well, then it was a lot of opportunism. People would ask me to be on staff because I was Indigenous, and then they would get more funding, and then they would just let me go. But in the art gallery scene, it was more ignoring me, or if I wasn't doing what they thought a typical Indigenous artist should be doing, then it was just sort of looking over, or like not even opportunism or anything like that, just like even worse, like just like you don't exist.
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with Amanda that it's a lack of space, or like the lack of relatability of sometimes what is happening and our own work or so. And there is like a logic to the art market and the labor market connected to it, but everything that is leaning back on like patriarchal and hierarchies will have this mistrust and opportunism happening, or it will have like an unfair way of valuing people sometimes that is very hard to deal with when we are creatives. At the same time, there are especially more institutes, smaller organizations that try to go beyond that and search for people that are sometimes working in different ways that are not the typical stereotypes for what sells as art or so. Yeah, also linking back to what I said before, even it has to do also to where you're settled. Some cities offer more opportunities than others, and they have different things happening and a broader view. But if you keep encountering situations that are very clearly unfair or mismanaged, it can be very frustrating to stay and keep creating and keep being proactive and involved, when sometimes things really feel like they're just not there for you in a good way.
Yeah, that's super important. I think part of the reason as well that I've stayed away is, well, I've been in Norway. The system is so different. And I often feel like my work doesn't maybe necessarily speak to the issues happening in the communities here.
The last thing I would add, which I'm now thinking of, reading the statements on my screen again. I mean, saying that the symbol of power and capital overshadows present cultural, social, and environmental issues, and that we have to grow to be successful, that we have to do more, and that we have to have higher numbers at institutions also. I mean, every year, if you go down in audience numbers, then maybe also your funding goes down. So I think it's also important to and I'm trying, or we are trying at the institution to do this, to organize events that aren't focused on getting more people inside, but organizing things that are focused because people are interested in that subject, and organizing things because we see that there is a gap somewhere that nobody is talking about, and organizing something about that, or inviting an artist to talk about a certain subject that has to get attention. And I think it's a minor thing, but maybe it helps.
Well, if there are no more rambling thoughts in anyone's head, then I suppose we've arrived at the end of our list of statements. So I want to thank all of you for this fantastic conversation. I think there were a lot of things that were said that will keep on going in my mind for quite some time. So I'm always very grateful for that stimulation. So thank you for your inputs. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. And I am looking forward to seeing more of the things you'll do and your practices in the future. But for now, I suppose we're going to round it off here and let the things boil over in our minds for some time.
It was a very nice conversation, and I was happy to join. Thank you all.
Thank you for including me, and I really, really look forward to learning more about all of your work. I'm just going to go read up on all of these things and be like, wow, what are they doing? So thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Miigwech. Bye.
This is No Resolution. Please annihilate that subscribe button.